This is the top of Proffit Mountain in Reynolds County, Missouri, and for about 25 minutes on a December morning, it was the source of the largest sudden flood the state had seen in decades. There was no storm that morning, no earthquake, no river in flood. The reservoir that sat up here did not fail because nature came for it. It failed because its own pumps filled it a few inches too high in the dark, and there was no one on the mountain to see the water go over the wall. It emptied itself. 1.3 billion gallons of water that had been lifted up here on purpose, hour after hour, night after night, came back down the mountain all at once and tore a 7,000-foot scar through a state park below. The date was December 14th, 2005. The time was a little after 5 in the morning, just before dawn, and the thing that beat this dam was not water pressure or bad rock. It was a sensor mounted a few inches too high and a backup alarm that someone had quietly switched off. I'm Simon. I'm a hydropower engineer, and this is the story of the Taum Sauk Upper Reservoir, a dam that drowned a valley with water it had carried up the mountain itself. To understand how a reservoir empties itself overnight, you first have to understand why anyone would build one on top of a mountain that has no river running into it. Taum Sauk was not a normal dam. It was a pumped storage plant, and a pumped storage plant is best thought of as a giant battery made of water. You build two reservoirs, one high and one low, and you connect them with a tunnel and a set of pump turbines. At night, when electricity is cheap and demand is low, you spend that cheap power running the machines in reverse, pumping water from the lower reservoir up to the high one. Then during the day, when demand spikes and power is expensive, you let that water fall back down through the same machines, and now they spin as generators. You lose a little energy on the round trip, but you buy low and sell high. And for a power grid, that storage is worth more than the energy you lose. Taum Sauk, when it came online in the early 1960s, was the first pure pumped storage plant of its kind in the United States, and for a time the largest in North America. It was an engineering landmark. In October of 2005, the professional body of electrical engineers formally recognized it as a milestone in the field. That recognition came just weeks before the reservoir it honored tore itself apart. The lower reservoir sat in the valley on the east fork of the Black River, held back by a conventional concrete dam. The upper reservoir is the one that concerns us, and it was an unusual structure. Crews blasted the top off Proffit Mountain and used the broken rock to build a ring, a kidney-shaped dike of dumped rock fill running about 1.25 miles around the summit, enclosing a basin roughly 55 acres across and around 90 feet deep. The inside face was lined with concrete panels to hold the water, and here is the detail that matters most. Along the very top of that rockfill ring ran a concrete parapet wall, about 10 feet tall, standing up on the crest like a curb along the edge of the summit. In a lot of the reservoir, that thin cantilever wall was the last few feet holding the water in. Storing water directly against a parapet wall on top of a rockfill dam like this was, in the words of the later investigation, essentially unprecedented. It left almost no margin. Most pumped storage reservoirs keep 3 to 5 feet of freeboard, meaning 3 to 5 feet of empty wall above the waterline as a cushion against waves, against a miscalculation, against a bad night. Freeboard is simply that safety gap between how high the water is and how high the structure goes. Taum Sauk was routinely run with as little as 1 or 2 feet of it, and critically, the original upper reservoir had no spillway. A spillway is the overflow drain every dam is supposed to have, the safe path for water to escape if the level ever climbs too high. This reservoir had none. If the water ever reached the top of that parapet wall, there was no relief valve. The only thing standing between a normal night and a catastrophe was knowing precisely how high the water was, and knowing that depended entirely on the instruments. So let me walk you through how this reservoir was supposed to keep itself safe, because the whole disaster lives inside that system. The plant ran largely on automation. At night, with almost no one on the mountaintop, the pumps would start filling the upper basin, and a set of sensors was supposed to watch the rising water and tell the pumps when to stop. The primary sensors were pressure gauges, instruments called piezometers, which measure water depth by measuring the weight of water above them. They sat inside protective conduit pipes that ran down the interface of the reservoir. As the water rose, the pressure rose. The control system read the depth, and when the reservoir reached its target level, the system was meant to ramp the pumps down and shut them off. That was the everyday control. And because everyone understood that a single system can fail, there was a backup, a last line of defense. Bolted near the top of the parapet wall was a second, independent set of sensors called Warwick probes. These worked on a completely different principle. They detected water by conductivity, by the simple fact that water completes an electrical circuit. If the water ever climbed high enough to touch those probes, they were wired to slam the pumps off immediately, not gently ramp them down, but cut them. Because if water was touching a probe up near the top of the wall, something had already gone badly wrong. The pressure gauges were the routine control. The Warwick probes were the failsafe. The reservoir's entire safety came down to those two systems doing their jobs on a dark, empty mountain. In 2005, both of them were compromised, and the people running the plant knew it. This is the part of the story that stops being about concrete and starts being about how warnings get explained away, one reasonable-sounding decision at a time. Through the autumn of 2005, the primary pressure gauges started misbehaving. The conduit pipes that held the sensors had come loose from their anchors. Investigators later found that the pumping action was sending water and trapped air surging through those pipes, and the anchor cables meant to hold the sensor array in place had failed, letting the instruments shift out of position. Once a depth gauge moves, its readings are no longer trustworthy because it no longer knows its own elevation. The water level plots from that autumn show the readings growing erratic, drifting further from reality as the weeks went on. And there had already been a warning that was impossible to miss. In late September of 2005, the reservoir overtopped. Water went over the wall, was noticed, and the plant kept operating. That should have been the moment everything stopped. Instead, the response was to manage around the bad readings rather than fix the underlying problem. The control programming was adjusted so the system would report the water level as lower than the drifting gauges were actually reading, to suppress what were treated as false high readings. And then the decision that the state regulators would later call not just imprudent but reckless. The fail-safe Warwick probes, the independent backup, were repositioned upward, set higher on the parapet wall than the lowest point along the crest. Employees told investigators the probes were raised so that water would stop triggering them. Sit with what that means. The last line of defense, the alarm that existed for exactly this scenario, was moved to a height where, on a reservoir routinely filled to within a foot or two of the top, the water might crest the lowest point of the wall and start pouring out before it ever rose high enough to wet the probes and trip the shutdown. The backup was still installed, it was still powered, it just could no longer see the failure it was built to catch. None of this was a single villain flipping a switch. It was a series of small, defensible-in-the-moment choices, each one trading a little more safety margin for a little less operational hassle, until there was no margin left. This is a pattern my field has a name for. We call it the normalization of deviance, the slow process by which a warning sign gets seen, nothing bad happens that particular day, and so the warning gets quietly reclassified as normal. Each time the reservoir ran a little too high and held, the too high became the routine. The danger never went away. It just stopped looking like danger. By the early hours of December 14th, every condition for the failure was in place, and no one was on the mountain to notice. The pumps had been running through the night, lifting water from the lower reservoir up into the basin as they had thousands of times before. 2 pumping units fed the reservoir. As the level climbed toward the top, the first unit shut down in its normal sequence, right on schedule. But the second unit kept running. The drifting pressure gauges did not register that the reservoir was already dangerously full, and so nothing told that second pump to stop. The water reached the top of the rockfill and touched the base of the parapet wall, and then it kept rising, and the Warwick probes, sitting up above the lowest point of the crest, stayed dry. There was no alarm because the alarm could no longer feel the water. Sometime a little after 5 in the morning, the reservoir began to overtop. At first, it would have been a thin sheet spilling over the low points of the wall, then a steady stream pouring down the outside face of the dike. And the outside of that dike was dumped rockfill, loose stone, the one thing you never want fast water running across. Water pouring over an embankment does not need long. It carries the finer material away, cuts a channel, and that channel funnels more water, which cuts it deeper and wider. The investigation found the reservoir overflowed for roughly 6 to 7 minutes before the pumps finally shut down, and by then it no longer mattered. The cascade had already stripped the rockfill out from under the parapet wall. The wall was a cantilever, a slab standing on its own footing, and once the water undermined that footing and scoured away the rock behind it, the wall had nothing to brace against. It tipped outward, and when it went, it opened the reservoir. What happened next took only minutes. A section of the dike, somewhere between 650 and 700 feet wide, gave way completely, and the upper reservoir drained through that breach in about 25 minutes. The peak discharge has been estimated at roughly 273,000 cubic feet per second, an enormous, brief flood released not by rain but by a wall falling over. Around 1.3 billion gallons of water surged over the northwest rim and down the side of Proffit Mountain as a crest reported at close to 20 feet high. It carved a channel some 7,000 feet long down the mountainside, scouring the slope down to ancient bedrock, ripping out mature forest, and carrying boulders, some the size of cars, down into the valley. The water was aimed, by the shape of the land, directly at Johnson's shut-in state park below. And here I have to slow down, because the human part of this story is the reason the record kept about that morning reads the way it does. At the entrance to the park stood a single house, the residence of the park superintendent, Jerry Toops. That night, Jerry, his wife Lisa, and their 3 young children were asleep inside it. Lisa, according to what the family later described, had fallen asleep on a couch in the early morning hours while feeding their youngest. Their children were 5, 3, and 7 months old. The house sat directly in the path of the flood. When the water reached it, it did not damage the house so much as erase it, tearing it off its foundation and leaving only the concrete slab behind. Jerry Toops later described the water hitting him in his own bedroom like a head-on collision. He was carried out of the house, made it to the roof, and could not find his family in the dark and the cold. He said afterward that he knelt and prayed they would be all right. All 5 of them were swept away in roughly 1 billion gallons of moving water in the middle of a December night. And all 5 of them survived. The children were pulled from the debris and the cold, taken to a hospital in St. Louis, and released over the following days. One of them was treated for burns caused, in a cruel detail, not by the flood, but by the heat packs rescuers applied to fight the child's hypothermia. 2 vehicles were pushed off the nearby state highway by the flood, and those drivers survived as well. Their father, reflecting on it later, said something I keep coming back to. He said they were the right people in the wrong place. The strength it took to come through that is not something engineering can take credit for. There is one more reason this story is measured in survivors instead of the dead, and it comes down to timing and design working in the family's favor where the instruments had failed them. It was December. The park campground, which sat in the flood path and was buried under as much as 40 feet of water and debris, was empty. In summer, it would have held families in tents and campers directly in the line of that wave, and the outcome does not bear thinking about. The other saving grace was the lower reservoir. The conventional dam down in the valley, the plant's other half, had been designed to hold a large share of the upper reservoir's volume, and when the flood came down the mountain, that lower dam caught it. It held. By absorbing the deluge, it spared the downstream towns of Lesterville and Centerville from what would otherwise have reached them, and the high water was ultimately contained before it could do worse. A voluntary evacuation went out downstream, but the flood was stopped. The dam that failed was the new, clever, automated one on the mountaintop. The dam that held was the ordinary one in the valley, doing exactly the boring job it was built for. When the water was gone and the counting began, the question was the same one that follows every one of these events. How did this happen, and who was responsible? And unlike some disasters, the answer here was not left vague. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission convened an independent investigation team, and the state ran its own inquiries as well. The findings pointed away from the men who happened to be on shift and toward the system around them. Investigators reported no evidence of operator error on the night of the failure. What they found instead was a combination of design and construction flaws in a reservoir that stored water against a parapet wall with too little freeboard and no spillway. And, on top of that, an organization that had continued running the plant after it knew its primary water level gauges were unreliable, that had reprogrammed the readings to mask the problem, and that had moved its fail-safe probes above the height they were meant to protect. The state's regulators, reviewing the same facts, used the word reckless. The operator, Emerina, was fined $15 million by federal regulators, at the time the largest penalty in that agency's history, and the company ultimately agreed to a settlement reported at around $180 million to the state and public entities for the damage done to the park and the region. No amount of that money could regrow a forest that had stood for centuries, and some of what the scour trail stripped off that mountain will not return in our lifetimes. The reservoir was rebuilt, and how they rebuilt it tells you what the profession took from this. The loose, rock-filled dike and its cantilever parapet wall were gone for good. In their place, Ameren constructed an entirely new upper reservoir out of roller-compacted concrete, a dense, durable method of building massive concrete structures in layers. The result was, at the time, the largest roller-compacted concrete dam in North America, containing on the order of 3 million cubic yards of concrete, an amount the utility compared to the volume used in the Hoover Dam. It was engineered with proper joints, real overflow protection, and a control philosophy that did not stake a valley's safety on a single set of sensors that no one was watching. The plant came back online in April of 2010. Johnson's Shut-in State Park, after a restoration reported at around $100 million, reopened to the public that same year, its ancient rock formations, the shut-ins themselves, having survived the flood remarkably intact even as the valley around them was rearranged. I started by telling you this dam emptied itself, and I want to be precise about what I meant, because the lesson is in the precision. The concrete panels did not fail under pressure. The foundation rock did not give way. There was no flood of rain, no seismic event, no act of nature at all. Every gallon of water that came down that mountain had been carried up there deliberately by machines doing exactly what they were told, because the one thing in the entire system that was supposed to tell them when to stop had been compromised and then quietly worked around. A pressure gauge drifted out of position, a fail-safe was moved a few inches too high, a reservoir with no margin and no spillway was left to fill itself in the dark. And a profession that builds for the storm and the earthquake was reminded that the failure can just as easily come from the inside, from an instrument reading a number that isn't true, and from an organization that had grown comfortable with a warning it had seen too many times to fear. The rebuilt reservoir sits up there today, generating power the same way, buying low and selling high, a battery made of water on top of a Missouri mountain. The difference now is that it is built to survive its own worst night. The reason unattended automated dams across this country get their instruments audited, their fail-safes checked against the actual height of the structure, and their assumptions questioned by people whose job is to distrust a comfortable reading is in no small part because of what happened here just before dawn on that December morning. 5 people were carried away in the dark and came back. The next time a system tells you everything is fine because it has always been fine, remember that the water on this mountain was rising the whole time, and the only alarm that could have caught it had been turned to face the wrong way. I'm Simon. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.